Hey, welcome to Kaonti Creations. In this video, I'll be showcasing my pin making process. The first thing I do is design my pins. I do this on Procreate, a drawing app for iPads. Designing the pins first allows me to draft out how I will eventually paint them, as well as help guide me when I make the clay casts for the pin molds. After the pins are designed, I make the casts out of clay. Casts are the external forms of an object, and we'll be using these clay casts to make negative mold impressions in silicone. I use Sculpey clay as it is easy to work with. I then bake them until they are hardened so that the clay doesn't get mixed with the silicone putty I use. For the silicone molds, I use Amazing Mold Putty. For this silicone, you need to mix a 1-to-1 ratio of both parts, and you have about 3 minutes of working time, which is just enough for me to mix them together and roll them over my casts. Once the molds are set, we can take the casts out of them. As you can see, the casts have left a negative impression in the putty so that when we melt plastic in the mold, the resulting plastic pin will be the same shape as the original cast. These molds are reusable, meaning you can make numerous plastic casts from the same mold without it ripping or losing its shape. However, you do need to have one mold for each pin shape that you'd like to make. The primary material for these pins is upcycled plastic. However, there are numerous kinds of plastic: PET, low density and high density polyethylene, PVC, polypropylene, and polystyrene. The list goes on. We can typically identify plastic based on resin identification codes that are present on most plastics. I use these resin ID codes to identify which plastics are safe for me to use for my pins. Because I melt the used plastic into molds, I collect the types of plastic that do not emit toxic fumes when melted, which include resin codes 1, 2, 4, and 5. I wash the plastic so that it is clean, then cut it up using scissors or a knife. I usually cut up plastic during my downtime, while I watch TV, wait for molds to set, plastic to melt, or paint to dry. It's a tedious job and a long process, but I have to cut it up individually until I can afford to buy or build a plastic shredder of my own. Before I put the molds in my toaster oven, I spray the silicone with nonstick spray. I then place the shredded plastic into the molds as flat as I can to avoid bubbles and voids. Unfortunately, my toaster oven does not display the temperature inside the oven, which makes it difficult to melt the plastic. I simply preheat it to the highest heat possible continuously until it is melted. Although I collect plastics that do not emit toxic gases when melted, I still melt them in a well-ventilated area and wear a facial mask. Even though the gases are non-toxic, they still don't smell that great, and you probably don't want to inhale an excessive amount of these gases. After the plastic has fully melted, I let it cool. A lot of the pins have voids and holes in them, and until I can figure out how to resolve this issue, I simply fill in the gaps with puffy fabric paint, left over from senior day t-shirts. Not many people melt plastic at home using a toaster oven, and no one I have seen so far have used silicone molds, so I have very limited online resources when it comes to my process. But science is all about experimentation, trial, and error. The more I experiment, the more I'll learn about the melting process and plastic properties. I coat the pins with a primer, which makes the plastic surface rougher and easier to paint. However, I don't spray the recommended 1 foot away from the surface I'm coating because I like it when the primer pools up into the leftover holes in the plastic and fills them. Once the primer is dried, I paint the pins. I use gouache, an idea I got from Cheyenne Barton, an amazing artist and YouTuber I really look up to. Her clay pin video was what inspired me to make pins, as I knew I wanted to create something with used plastic, but I didn't know what it was that I wanted to make. The pins usually require 3 to 4 coats of gouache. I got this gouache from a family member of my aunt's spouse, which seems confusing, but that's Filipino culture for you. I sometimes mix the gouache with some acrylic paint or watercolor that I have lying around, but using solely acrylic paint is not desirable because 1. The paint cracks on top of the plastic pins, and 2. Acrylic paint is composed of tiny particles of plastic and water, which seems counterproductive to my mission of reducing the virgin plastic demand. The more we buy products made from virgin plastic, the larger the market for virgin plastic products becomes. Our world is already polluted by existing plastic. Creating a reason for companies to produce more of it is not what we want to do. As we examine my process, it seems rather hypocritical for me to use polymer clay, acrylic paint, and epoxy resin. In my eyes, there's no shame in using acrylic paint and polymer clay that I was given or already own. Being wasteful is not the name of the game. As long as we try in the future not to buy products made of virgin plastic, we are doing our best. And that's enough. I'm still experimenting with different mediums for the pin's glossy coating, and I'm trying to produce a glossy sealant from transparent recycled plastic in lieu of store-bought resin, which is virgin plastic. However, like I mentioned earlier, few have experimented with at-home plastic melting. There are a few resources out there, but no one has used a process similar to mine. I have yet to see anyone turn plastic into a gloss coating. If my sealant experimentations fail, I'll look into finding natural sealant options that are also long-lasting. Currently, recycling plastic is pretty inefficient because virgin plastic is actually cheaper than recycled plastic. Consequently, companies prefer to produce virgin plastic for their products as opposed to using recycled plastic in order to keep costs down. This is because the recycling flow is heavily contaminated with food, grease, and other things that cannot be recycled, and it isn't cheap to decontaminate plastic. Unfortunately, because companies opt to use virgin plastic, much of the plastic we put in our recycling bins aren't actually being reincarnated as new products. Much of it is unbought and shipped to landfills overseas, where it plagues low-income communities as well as the environment. This is why making products from plastic that has already been used and discarded is so important. Instead of polluting the earth and low-income communities, we can simply reshape used plastic into new products over and over again. By creating pins with used plastic, I hope to help curb plastic waste in my own small way, as well as normalize reshaping plastic through affordable, accessible means. Even if I don't end up making a huge impact on plastic pollution, I can rest easy knowing that I did my best given my circumstances. I use a 1-to-1 ratio of resin and hardener according to my resin label's instructions. I use an old brush to apply the epoxy resin onto the pins, then leave them to harden for a day on a rack that I created from chopsticks and spare wire. It works pretty well as it allows the pins to set without getting stuck to a bunch of paper or the table. I use rubbing alcohol or acetone to clean my brush and little measuring cup once I finish applying the resin. And look at that! We have a finished product. I'm really pleased with how they turned out. They're pretty colorful and glossy. Be sure to check out my Etsy, Tumblr, or Instagram to stay updated on my recycling journey, art, and store. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video.